like to know also, as far as the patents go, I mean, if you have a genetically modified crop and there's a patent on it and then it gets crossbred with another plant, I mean, are the farmers then responsible for paying off to the patent holders?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a new precedent in Ontario where 4 soybean farmers were sued by Monsanto just this October, and they were forced to pay Monsanto, well, a substantial part of Monsanto's legal fees, as well as paying back profit and interest on that profit that they made. And they're also now on something new that Monsanto has created, which is an unauthorized growers list, where because they've been found guilty of unauthorized use of Monsanto's patent, they're now on a blacklist where they can't buy Monsanto's seed or products into the future. And of course, this is it was raised by the National Farmers Union recently that this is a huge issue in terms of companies that dominate the seed market determining what or how farmers farm. So certainly with SmartStax, which is expected to dominate the seed market, and just to say it has been approved for release in Canada, and the seed is probably just now being imported from the United States. And so all seed companies, certainly in Ontario, are expecting that SmartStax will already dominate the market, and that it will be harder and harder for farmers to find seeds that aren't SmartStax, and so even single trait products. But since you asked this question about contamination, and we're speaking in Ontario, certainly Ontario organic corn farmers do establish these buffer zones or isolation distances, and this is the mechanism by which they limit contamination possibilities. But as the panel mentioned, this can happen, contamination can happen in any number of ways, and human error is sort of one of them that has already happened with transgenic pigs, for example. So, you know, we can't keep track of large organisms, let alone, you know, pollen. Please.
I have 2 questions. The first is I'm a local organic farmer, and I have GE corn next to me, quite a bit of it. And so I'm saying, and there's been different varieties approved in Canada here. Here's one more. I'm hearing that it's somewhat different, but where's this all going? I mean, the Canadian public is already used to GE corn, whether they like it or not, and I have to put up with it. Occasionally, some get into my field. What can you do about it, or why is this? If there's so much GE corn now, what I won't say what's the difference, but where's this going? Who's going to be affected by this? I should just say what the second question is? Okay. If I'm understanding correctly, there's very few independent studies that are showing what some of the effects are happening. And it seems it's couched more in the allergy reactions rather than disease or other reactions, toxicity reactions. And I'm going, well, do people know the effect on, you're mentioning a bit about farmers, on older people as opposed to younger people, or 20 years now or 40 years from now? I mean, I'm astounded to find that there's so few monitoring or surveillance or independent studies.
That is a question which I think is for everyone to participate in and to shape, because after all, it's sort of the agriculture or the food of the people in the country, isn't it? So therefore, a scientist is sort of the last one you might want to ask, you know. So I cannot give you more on that, but I'm sure sort of there would be others here who would be happy to debate that. So I'll quickly hop to the second question, therefore. In terms of testing, and you shouldn't forget that, for one thing, if you want to monitor, you have to have labeling. There's no way around that. And as far as I know, please correct me, do you have labeling here? You don't, right? So you have already like quite a hurdle here if you want to do the monitoring. The other thing is that there have no long-term studies been done, and certainly not also in terms of age differences. There have been some animal studies, but for humans we wouldn't know at all. And we shouldn't forget that a lot of what has been grown has been for animal feed. So in a way, quite a lot of the effects so far, we would have to look at how it's been affecting animals. And therefore the question is, like, at which level will it really start to go into the ordinary food chain? And so there's quite a lot of questions there, but we do not have the studies that actually would help us sort of decide wisely at present. So we need to learn more. But maybe Michael has something else to say there.
Yeah, I only mentioned the allergenistic because I had a very short amount of time, but that's the one where there's the strongest link, but there is actually evidence of adverse impacts on the gut, a series of studies that were done that on some of the cry proteins. Yes, these are again animal studies, but before you approve something for the human market, they usually don't do human studies. They do animal studies because it's considered unethical to do some of the human studies. What? Yeah, well, yeah, there is actually a large-scale human study going on right now with both the U.S. and the Canadian population, but we don't know what the impacts will be because there's no way to trace what people are eating because of the lack of labeling. But there hasn't even been adequate long-term testing based on animal studies, which you would have for anything else you put in a food additive. Food coloring requires more safety testing.
The one thing I would add is, I think it was in the early 2000s, there was a lot of public concern around this issue, and that was around the time the Royal Society of Canada released their expert panel report in 2001. And among the recommendations were sort of around monitoring and surveillance and more detailed evaluation. And the Canadian government, I think, felt they had to respond at the time because public concern was really quite high. And I think that's the lesson here is around public concern, because in 2002, I think, is when Health Canada hosted a conference on monitoring and surveillance. And one of the things they learned is we don't have a control population in Canada because we don't have labeling. And it doesn't look like, I mean, from my analysis of what they did, it doesn't look like that ever carried any further than 2002. Similarly, Environment Canada was encouraged by the Royal Society of Canada to look at some of the longer-term environmental effects, and they started a program called Ecosystem Effects of Living Modified Organisms, I think it was called. And I sort of tried to track that down a couple of years ago, and it sounded like they kind of launched this file and gathered a bunch of proposals from researchers, and then that just kind of ended as well. And I think in both cases, when the public concern drops, and these are complicated scientific questions, especially when you're talking the monitoring and surveillance and baseline data collection and potentially very expensive. So if the public concern starts to dip down, then the files languish.